Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Great to see you again. Many of you have been here since yesterday. I know some of you are new. I'm Ala Kubaj, the Dean of the College of Engineering at UTRGV, and we are happy for how this conference and this symposium have been going. Actually, this morning, the first session, we had over 100 participants, and actually now, and many people will be joining, and it's Friday, and we have many participants. So we are really excited about the turnout and the participation for this symposium. I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Dr. Mora, who is a co-PI on this symposium. I think she's somewhere there, and also Dr. McMahon. Also, have been really key to this project, as well as all the staff and students who have made this possible. Today, we have two amazing speakers to continue on the many other speakers we have. And let me start by introducing them. I'll introduce both of them, and then after that, I'll turn it to them, to give their keynote presentation. And I'll start with Dr. Virginia Valian, who is a distinguished professor of psychology at Hunter College. She directs the Language Acquisition Research Center and the Gender Equity Project. Dr. Valian performs research on the reasons behind women still too slow advancement and insufficient recognition, and proposes remedies for individuals and institutions. She is the author of Why So Slow? The Advancement of Women, and also the co-author with Dr. Abby Stewart of Inclusive Academy, Achieving Diversity and Excellence. And talking about the co-author, let me move to introduce her co-author on that book, Dr. Abby Stewart, who is a distinguished university professor of psychology and gender and women studies at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on women's life, psychology of women's lives, personality, and adaptation to personal and social changes. She co-edited a book, Transforming Science and Engineering, Advancing Academic Women. And she's also, as I mentioned, the co-author of the Inclusive Academy, Achieving Diversity and Excellence with Dr. Virginia Valian. As I mentioned, she has served as a director and of advanced grants and participated in many diversity initiatives. So without any further introduction, I would like to turn it to Dr. Valian and Dr. Stewart.
Thank you very much. Okay. Hello, everyone. Abby Stewart and I are honored to be part of the NSF Include Symposium. We thank you for inviting us. Our talk today analyzes two of the many challenges that Latinas in academic STEM face, and we present principles that we think can reduce the impact of those challenges. Our sources include work done by advanced institutions, including those who have presented during this symposium, research and theory in social science, and our experience in our own institutions and visiting other institutions. Our book presents more analysis and more recommendations than we can review today. The challenge that I will discuss is isolation, invisibility, marginalization, and lack of inclusion. We see these challenges as challenges that the environment creates. White women and men and women of color are more likely than white men to experience isolation and marginalization, and women of color are especially at risk for both being invisible and on occasion hypervisible. Our analysis concentrates on 4 processes that feed those phenomena, and I'm going to go through those in turn. Let's start with the belief that one's good intentions are sufficient. People are very aware of their own good intentions, ignoring the adage about what the road to hell is paved with. People want to be fair, and they pride themselves on being fair. One of the most common remarks that we encounter when we visit schools is, I don't care who they are, I just want the best person. But a number of studies show the danger of believing fully in one's fairness. Those studies find that suggestions to people that they are fair leads to their being unfair. For example, people might be asked to recommend either a man or a woman for a male-dominated position. Before they make their recommendation, one group sees a set of statements like, most women are not very smart. They are asked to indicate the extent of their agreement. Another group sees a set of statements like, some women are not very smart. People who get the statements about most women tend to disagree with them, while people who get the some women statements tend to agree, since of course, some women are not very smart. The people who read and disagreed with the most women statements are more likely to go on to recommend a man for the male-dominated position. When people remind themselves of how fair they are, they feel licensed, morally licensed, to be unfair. People think that their good intentions inoculate them against unfairness, but they do not. The literature on moral licensing teaches us, or should teach us, to be humble about our good intentions, not to pat ourselves on the back. The second source of error that we'll discuss is schemas. The term schema is similar to stereotype, but it's more neutral in its connotations, so we prefer it for that reason. Schemas are a natural cognitive structure that we use to make quick categorizations, and they influence how we perceive, interpret, and remember objects, situations, and people. We have schemas about everything. We have schemas that are based on gender, race, ethnicity, class, and so on. And schemas about groups have particular content. When we see individuals through a schematic lens, we tend to evaluate their performance in part via our beliefs about the social groups that they belong to. And we are thus at risk of underestimating the accomplishments of people who are in those groups compared to the dominant group. Take one example by Moss-Racusin and her colleagues, showing that natural scientists, chemists, physicists, biologists, evaluate a dossier for a lab manager less positively if it has a female rather than a male name at the top. This was true for both male and female evaluators, and it was particularly true for those scientists who believe that gender discrimination is no longer a major problem. You can see the connection there with moral licensing. Schemas, as I indicated on the slide, are also detailed. So the content of our schema for Latinas has particular content, and that content may differ depending on who the perceiver is. The next process that I'll discuss is homophily. You see on the left-hand side a network with two kinds of individuals, red and blue, and they are very separate. And on the right-hand side, a network that has a mix of people. Homophily refers to the fact that people tend to associate with others who resemble them, and they expect to be more comfortable about interacting with those people. This experience leads them to have more familiarity, not just with some groups, but with their own group. The dimensions on which resemblance is based include age, religion, education, occupation, race, ethnicity, and of course, gender. Homophily works against diversity and inclusion by leading to marginalization and failing to include those who aren't in the dominant group. Recent research suggests that homophily can also be used for diversity and inclusion. Spitzmiller, who moderated a session yesterday with Madeira and their colleagues, have analyzed over 13,000 applications for academic jobs. They find that search committees that have women chairs and a greater percentage of women attract 23% more women applicants. Similarly, but more extremely, search committees that have underrepresented minority chairs and greater percentages of underrepresented minority faculty on the committee attract 100% more underrepresented minority applications. This is partly because women and underrepresented minorities make more efforts to recruit a diverse group of applicants, either by speaking to personal contacts or by posting job ads where underrepresented groups are likely to see them. Recent research suggests that homophily, as I said, can be used for diversity. So it generally works badly, but it can work well. As Jesse DeAro and Tatiana Camacho described in their talk yesterday, intersectionality is generally neither well understood nor attended to in academia. Intersectionality refers to the ways that individuals and groups are positioned within social structures that define power relations. These intersections include many different hierarchical relations. Let's consider now what principles can address the problems. The first is to develop institutional understanding of intersectionality. The second is to focus on policies and procedures, because providing information, even changing attitudes, is not enough. We need to change policies and procedures. Yesterday, Drs. DeAro and Camacho described particular ways that institutions can address and have addressed intersectionality. An important reason to change policies and procedures is that if changes become part and parcel of how an institution acts, then reliance on individuals will not be required. Abby will later address particular policies. The next principle is to motivate change. A good motivator, in addition to fairness, is the idea of bringing out everyone's contributions. We know that several characteristics of teams and groups help do that. Teams that value difference and the particular contributions that each person makes are teams that work better. Groups that are challenging without being destructive work better. Negativity tends to dominate, so that even small amounts of negative feedback can signal that someone does not belong or is not a valued contributor. On the positive side, creating a sense of belonging brings out people's best. There are both formal and informal ways to accomplish that. A formal way is to launch people when they first enter an institution by creating launch committees that help people understand how the institution works and how to get things done, and facilitates access to the resources that people need. The next principle is universal design. The idea behind universal design is that treating people equally requires taking difference into account. That may sound contradictory. The idea is to make the intellectual environment one in which everyone can thrive. We have to know what different groups need in order to come up with a solution that will maximize the number of people who will benefit. We also need to take variability into account by realizing that people differ both across social groups and within social groups. Universal design should be good for everyone. Take the example of curb cuts. Although they were intended initially for people with compromised mobility, they turn out to be useful for multiple situations. Universal design should be good for everyone. It takes time and thought and planning to set up, but it does not disadvantage anyone. Finally, mentoring, which many institutions provide, is a helpful tool for improving inclusion and making success more likely. Earlier today, Doctors Villalobos, Sanguinetti, Salas Ramirez, and Neubauer discussed excellent mentoring models and self-directed strategies. I highly recommend viewing that panel if you were not present. We know that white men are the most likely to receive informal mentoring, mentoring that doesn't even seem to be mentoring. Under the umbrella of mentoring is listening to an individual's articulation of their own goals rather than imposing the goals that the mentor might prefer, providing information and providing support, advocating, and sponsoring. I'll focus here on models of mentoring, which was also brought up this morning. It's helpful for everyone to have a composite mentor or network of mentors, or to use the term we use at Hunter College, a circle of advisors. No single person can provide all the information and support and sponsorship that everyone needs. With a circle of advisors, people determine themselves what they need and who might be helpful for those needs. They don't rely on a single person, but on a network that includes peers as well as people who are more senior. A network of mentors not only expands a scholar's network, but it avoids a problem that can arise in classical mentoring where a senior person directs the junior person. So those are 5 ways that we can address at the institutional level the problem of lack of inclusion and belonging. Abby will take over now.
If I may say something, Abby, before you start, if you have questions for Dr. Valian, we encourage you to put them through the chats for the sake of time. And once Dr. Stewart finish her presentation, then we can take the questions and Dr. McMahon can help me with that. Just want to make sure if you have questions, make sure to write them down. Go ahead, Dr. Stewart.
Thank you very much. I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to everyone's questions. So the second challenge that we wanted to address today is the challenge of fair treatment. And that is a particular challenge in the academic context because evaluation is so core to the academic enterprise and especially to academic science. But we would argue that it's the most salient institutional feature that gives faculty an idea either that the institution is fair or that it's unfair. if we look at evaluation processes in the academy, we notice right away that they are ubiquitous. We are constantly evaluating articles, grant proposals, and students' products ourselves, but we are also having our products, our work products, evaluated by others. We also evaluate people, and we are evaluated as people when we engage in admissions processes, annual reviews, mid-career reviews, tenure and promotion reviews, and in some contexts, post-promotion reviews. Not only are evaluations ubiquitous, but they are consequential at the moment. When you get admitted or you do not, it has consequences for the next stage of your career. If you get promoted or you do not, or if you get that grant or you do not. And they are also cumulative. The impact of each acceptance or rejection has implications, as do the experiences individuals have in the course of those processes. The feeling they come away with of being respected and valued, or on the opposite end of being disrespected and not valued, can have permanent consequences for their relationship to an institution. So evaluation processes are not only informative, they are consequential for the person and consequential for the institutional relationship. And if that were not enough, for all the reasons Virginia has talked about and many more, evaluation processes are subject to error, subject to the kinds of cognitive errors that Virginia talked about in the beginning, subject to group process errors that are a result of what goes on in a community. They are also subject to the fact that we are not equally good judges of everybody. And that means that we may evaluate some people who belong to some groups differently than people who belong to other groups. Now, belonging to a group does not mean you are exactly like every other member of that group, and we all know that. So Latina faculty absolutely differ from one another in many ways, but they all share a social position in which they are disadvantaged in particular ways by gender and race or ethnicity. And that intersectional positioning is something that institutions are not yet very skilled at thinking about. Most of all, they don't even recognize these hierarchies or intersections at all. But they also don't know how to address them in policies and practices. They worry that if they think about what would be good for Latinas or for African Americans, that somehow that would count as special treatment. And worse, that it would stigmatize people from that social group. I want to stress that we don't believe that addressing these issues automatically means that you are going to stigmatize or one group or favor them over other groups, particularly because of the concept of universal design that Virginia spoke about. So we can think about an intersection or many intersections without creating policies and practices that are unique to those intersections. And that's one of the things we want to emphasize. So understanding why fair treatment is challenging in the academy in particular, and in academic science, is that we rely heavily on proxy measures of excellence. We much more than we rely on direct assessment of excellence. So if we're considering hiring an individual, we may pay attention to the prestige of the institutions they were educated at or that they had their first job at. That does not actually tell us a single thing about that individual's excellence, but we act like it does. We also may do that about the recommender of the individual who's applied. Do we know of that person's work? Are they very fancy in the field? Are we inclined to take their recommendation more seriously than the recommendation of someone we don't know, haven't heard of, and who may not be as fancy? Letters of recommendation more generally are proxy measures of excellence. That's taking someone else's word for the excellence of this individual's work, as are student evaluations, in contrast to our own visits to our colleagues' classrooms. Worst of all are the really meta distant proxy measures of excellence, like the impact factor of the journals you publish in or your citation rate as captured in H indexes. These are, though, I want to stress, all items that are relied on heavily in institutional evaluation processes, and we recommend trying to move away from this kind of reliance and to recognize that relying on it, in fact, introduces error rather than information. So how do we change our practices? So our first and most important message is you can start anywhere. There are evaluation practices all over the place. Pick one and try to work on it. We know that it's likely that whatever you work on will generalize to other ones. Many institutions started out in the early days of advanced funding doing systematic reviews of policies that are in place. That can be very helpful in trying to choose one that looks particularly flawed. Another frequent choice was to focus on search practices because hiring seemed like the best way to address diversity issues. There's a lot of doubt about that now. Addressing the kinds of issues Virginia talked about in terms of climate may be more important, or certainly as important. You can pick wherever the institution thinks the greatest need is. If you're most worried about your tenure process or your annual review process, start there, and then build out to other evaluation contexts. The second principle is to examine and amend the procedures that are in place. So you know what those procedures are, or maybe in some cases they may not be well articulated. Make sure that you do know what they are and then change them to fit with your goal of increasing inclusion and fairness. If you do start with searches, and I'm going to start there just to have a place to start, one thing you can do is require search committees to learn about underlying issues and helpful practices, which is something that many advanced institutions have done in the past now 20 years. They've created mechanisms for search committees to learn about better practices that will slow down the process, make it more thoughtful and more fair. I want to re-stress something Virginia stressed, which is when the search committee is aiming to recruit Latinas in STEM, or when that's even a value or goal, to consider proactive recruitment cannot be ignored. It's important. And not only the kinds of steps that Virginia talked about that are based on undoing homophily, undermining homophily, but there are more. Encourage the participation of faculty in the search committee in national conferences where they hear people giving talks. Encourage them to go to talks of people they don't know who may be members of other social groups, and use those opportunities to get to know someone proactively before you even have a recruitment. So using the procedures that are normal in academic science, attending conferences, listening to talks, inviting speakers, using those as proactive recruitment strategies rather than just waiting till someone applies. And of course, the things that Virginia mentioned, who's chairing the committee, who's on the committee, who's reaching out to what networks, those are important practices as well. So the second thing is describe and explain whatever the helpful practices are. Many have been documented and we cover lots of them in the book. One of them that I would stress is the importance of developing clear criteria for the position at the beginning before you look at a single file, and then having each person or product assessed on all criteria. One of the things we do is take shortcuts, look at the thing we care the most about. That's going to increase the unfairness of the process to those people and groups who are underrepresented currently. We have to motivate helpful practices. Committee members are going to use shortcuts if we don't teach them and remind them of how important fairness in this process is, and the fact that that fairness will be only possible if we slow processes down and engage in them more thoughtfully. For example, by using a rubric that lists all the criteria and using all the criteria in our discussion. Even more important than our processes, I want to stress that we can And some institutions are amending, changing their evaluation criteria. The introduction of DEI statements in applications for jobs is an example of at least including new information. It doesn't guarantee that anybody pays attention to it in the hiring. So that, to our mind, is advanced by thinking about it as part of the evaluation criteria. Why is that justified? It's justified because we need faculty who can mentor diverse students. We need faculty who can contribute to research that's important to non-academic communities. We need faculty who have a capacity for outreach to underserved communities, or to contribute leadership on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts on campus. If we need faculty with these qualities, then these qualities should be part of our evaluation criteria. If we don't list them, we can't pay attention to them, and we certainly can't notice who has them and who doesn't. Once you've changed the practices, changed the criteria, then you need to implement improved evaluation practices in the process, and that requires developing formal policies. For example, requiring that all review committees be educated and that they be made accountable for outcomes. Now, accountability is nobody's favorite thing. Nobody wants to be held accountable, as this cartoon indicates. It's easier if we blame somebody else. In the case of hiring, when it isn't the case that we have a diverse shortlist, we can blame those people who didn't apply for not applying. We can blame the field. We can blame the world. But instead, we can ask that the committee be accountable for the diversity of the shortlist. And if we do that, then we can hold the committee accountable by refusing to accept a shortlist. If that has been made an explicit outcome that must be the result of a search committee's process, a diverse pool of applicants and a diverse shortlist. We can also hold people accountable for other outcomes like the climate of a department, of a laboratory, of a research center. This kind of accountability is more difficult because it's harder to measure, but it isn't impossible. And it's very important that those people who could be held accountable for the climate understand that it's part of their job to do that. If the climate's composed in part of fair treatment, people experiencing themselves as being held to standards in a fair and reasonable way, then we need to hold people accountable for fair treatment itself. So the components of the climate can be unpacked so that people can be held accountable for another element, the perception of belonging and inclusion. If you have on the walls of your department images of only one social group of, say, department chairs or winners of big prizes, that may signal to lots of people, faculty and students, that maybe this is a department I don't belong in, I'm not included in. Day to day, signals of not belonging and not being included or not being listened to, not getting interrupted, having people attribute your ideas to somebody else. Those perceptions of belonging and inclusion, or of not belonging and exclusion, are a piece of the climate, and we can hold people accountable for that climate. For respectful treatment of everybody in the course of processes, for fair evaluation processes, for explicitly taking account of the points where bias might enter a process. For example, many committees now only consider letters of recommendation after the committee members have read and discussed the research itself and the person's record. By moving the consideration of the letters to later in the process, they play a different role, verifying judgments rather than creating a kind of consensus based on lack of information. And then I've already talked about the regular review of criteria. This is going on in different fields in different ways, but it can go on. It seems often like these criteria are carved in stone and can't be rethought, but that is untrue. Now, I want to recognize that accountability below is fairly easy, even though it's rarely done. So at a level above search committees, but the department chair, you can include the requirements of that job in the job description. You can say the department chair will be held accountable for perceptions of fair treatment, for perceptions of inclusion, and they will be asked in their annual review to describe what they've done to ensure fair treatment in evaluations and inclusion. How to minimize the kinds of microaggressions that are signals of exclusion, how to keep conversations civil rather than have them deteriorate into conversations some people feel they have a loud voice in and other people have no voice at all. As I mentioned, you can connect this to the annual review. The accountability for higher ups is tricky, and there in the current university, and this is just an example, there are a lot of higher ups, and it's much more difficult for us on the ground to hold people above us accountable. There are some methods, there are evaluation review processes that can be undergone, and they can make a difference. They can be tailored to particular topics in particular years. So I encourage you all to think about ways that people, faculty on the ground, can in fact hold people in higher level positions accountable to them, acknowledging that that's not easy to do. So I'm going to conclude with a few final thoughts. Institutional change, and we're all in the business of wanting institutional change, it depends on changing a lot of things. So one of the things it requires is changes in knowledge and expertise. We have to learn a lot of things in order to understand how to make it. And the one we are emphasizing with respect to Latinas in STEM is knowledge about intersectionality, knowledge that thinking about intersectionality does not automatically lead to problems. It can lead to better universal designs of practices that will help everyone. Secondly, we believe that change in policies is almost always required. Some of the obvious places are recruitment, and it's not here, but tenure and promotion may need changes in the policies. Lots of institutions have focused on dual career and family-friendly policies in order to be more accessible to women. It turns out that it is also the case that many underrepresented minorities have different needs with respect to dual career and family-friendly policies. And again, universal design, if we think explicitly intersectionally, would allow us to create policies that will serve everyone better. We've talked a lot in this talk, I think, about practices on the ground. That's because we think the day-to-day lives of our faculty in departments and in schools and colleges within larger institutions, that is the life that matters, the everyday experience that matters for institutional commitment, engagement, satisfaction, and indeed fairness. So those practices must be a focus. And then finally, the climate is the cumulative effect of all these things, ideally. If our practices and policies and understanding are broader, richer, deeper, then the community will be more fair and more inclusive. And then I just want to close by saying successful change efforts often combine grassroots engagement, everybody is on board, along with leadership from the top. And we're well aware that sometimes one or the other seems to be missing, and that missing piece can slow change. It doesn't have to stop it. So we want to emphasize that wherever you are in an institution, at the top, the middle, or the bottom, you can contribute to and even create change. Even though you'll need allies, you'll need support, there is no position from which you can't contribute to or create change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart and Dr. Valian. We have a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to go ahead and read. And the first one comes from Eileen. How do we address, or Aileen, how do we address the idea of we picked the best candidate that applied in hiring? How do we search for a wider pool without overlooking perfectly qualified but not terribly diverse applicants?
Do you want to start, Virginia?
I'll start and then you can continue, Abby. I think that the practices that Abby suggested in particular, which is making sure that you know who's out there. So one of the other things that we hear in addition to, I just want the best person, is there aren't any people in a particular area. But it turns out there are people in that area. And you can find them when, as Abby says, you do things like go to conferences and go to meetings of graduate students who are in particular groups. So many science groups have Black psychologists, for example, or Latina psychologists, and get to know those people as they are on their way up. Also exploiting the network that you do have in order to encourage people to apply. One problem that especially prestigious institutions can have, not that they necessarily see it as a problem, is that people think that there's no chance of their being considered there. So an institution can go out of its way to indicate that it wants people to apply. The worry about white men, basically, I don't think that's much of a worry. They're going to apply. In the organizational literature, there are suggestions that to the extent that you can use similar criteria and evaluate people who are similar, then you have to rely on some of the other values that are important to you, such as how will this person contribute to diversity and how will they contribute to mentoring, things that should already be part, but those can be the elements that make someone look more or less right for your institution.
I think Virginia's covered that question quite well. The one thing I'll add is just a footnote to her point about people selecting not to apply because they think you don't want them. I usually talk about this as there are schemas about institutions. There are schemas about disciplines and fields and departments, and those schemas can drive applicant behavior. So if you think there might be a schema that's in the way of recruiting applicants of a certain kind, you need to reach out to those people and persuade them that there is a reason that your institution actually is interested.
One thing I'll add to that I just thought of is people can pay more attention to their websites. So a website for a department can look more or less welcoming. I remember going to one school that I looked at ahead of time. None of their images included a person. And when I brought that up, they said, well, we didn't want to emphasize anybody, so we thought we just wouldn't include any people at all. A lot of people are going to be turned off by that, perhaps some of the very people whom you want to attract. So websites are a really easy way that people can convey a welcoming atmosphere.
We have another question from Marie. Since faculty are usually represented on search committees for deans and provosts, how can they make their voices heard on the importance of holding candidates accountable for diversity, equity, and inclusion? What else can faculty do to amplify the importance of DEI to the senior administration?
So one strategy is one I talked about, which is making sure it gets on the list of criteria. So first of all, discussing criteria, and secondly, making sure that some versions of this concern get into the list of criteria. You can also advocate for questions in the interviews once you reach that stage, which of course may be too late to make a big difference, but asking questions about what experiences have stood out for you, that you've been successful in promoting diversity, equity, or inclusion, and what has stood out where you fell short, and what did you learn from that experience? These kinds of behaviorally based experience questions definitely help sort of sift people who actually have nothing to say and separate them from the people who have a lot to say and a lot to offer on these issues.
Marie, I don't know if your question was also getting at the fact that the faculty on those committees aren't necessarily paid attention to. I think that's a bigger problem to address, but I think there are things that one can do there as well. So when one is asked, one can say, I would love to serve. Here are some of the things that would be important to me as far as my voice being a meaningful contribution. Will that be possible on this committee? And then, assuming they say yes, because what can they say? No, we don't care about your voice. Then that's something that you can bring up at the committee. You may recall that we agreed that faculty would be able to do X, Y, and Z. But I think it's tough.
We don't have any other questions in the chat, but we have comments. So if there are any other questions, this would be the great time to ask them. Fantastic. We have a comment from Beth Michnick. Thanks for a great talk. During COVID times, many faculty have to count on their colleagues' good intentions for fair annual or promotion and tenure evaluations. What about our Latina faculty who may not feel that their evaluations are fair before COVID? That's an excellent question, Beth.
Do you want to start, Virginia, or you want me to?
Why don't you start?
Okay. The first thing I think I would say is that this is a case where institutions are really grappling with how to ask, I think good institutions are grappling with how to encourage the identification of reasons that people might need particular consideration around COVID and the risk of stigma. I think the risk of stigma is non-trivial here, and it is of course amplified for women in general and Latinas in particular. So I think solutions that rely on collective expression are better than asking the individual to disclose lots of personal information. So institutional inclusion of institutional information that holding people accountable for the amount of time it took to do things is not appropriate, under this time frame. And within the annual review process, where time is often very limited, having an opportunity for the institution to both measure. So institutional surveys about faculty time have been very informative. Most of them are finding people spend much more time on teaching and much less time on research than they have in the past. And then adjusting criteria weighting, not so much what the criteria are, but the weighting of the criteria for that review. It's also been found that people have been spending much less time on this kind of activity, meaning national and international conferences and professional networking, and those are likely to be costly over the long haul to people's career. So I guess the important takeaways here are trying to make this an institutional solution, either at the department level, the school level, or the university level, more than an individual solution. The problem of mistrusting the fairness of the process, but for a particular group, it only is compounded. There's no way it's helpful in this situation. That mistrust is bound to be compounded by a sense that this year and perhaps next year are going to be unique or different.
Abby mentioned in her section of the talk the need to examine and amend evaluation criteria. It's possible that the pandemic could be an opportunity for people to do that. Abby particularly mentioned the capacity to contribute to research important to non-academic communities and the capacity for outreach to underserved communities. Those are criteria that most institutions seldom even consider. And thinking about those as criteria that are important at all times, and trying to get those criteria to be part of the evaluation is something that schools can do. And maybe COVID could be an opportunity to do that. I'll mention here also the increasing use of dashboards that universities and colleges are using based on work by Omira and colleagues showing that women are asked more to do things, and that's true for women of color as well as white women, and they say yes more. And that has a cost, because although the institution needs those activities in order to function, it doesn't reward them very much. So I think during COVID times, a lot of dedicated faculty are spending time outside of their classes, having meetings with students who are burdened in various ways by the pandemic, and keeping those students in school, keeping them moving forward. That's something that the university or college should be valuing highly. And I think that's another thing that could be brought up again during these times.
That's such a great point. And as a professor, I can echo that is very true. The extra labor that faculty, especially female faculty and women of color, are putting into making sure that students stay in their classes and finish out the semester. We have another related question on the challenges during COVID, and then that's by Arlette. And then I'll go ahead and ask the question by Marielle. And I believe that will be, that'll probably be our last question, but we'll see how the time goes. So what can committees do to make sure they are following new committee changes once they are implemented? Some individuals were challenged more this academic year due to the challenges of the prior year. What could be done to account for that in this upcoming annual review? So, yeah.
I think it's very similar that, I mean, the solution is very similar to the things we just outlined, which is making that an explicit understanding of the review committee and of the faculty filling out their forms, that there is a recognition of this kind of cumulative cost year to year. This is going to create, of course, downstream implications for how we review people for tenure. And I'll just slip into this conversation that one of the pernicious practices we engage in, many institutions engage in, is using time-based criteria for evaluating people for tenure. How many articles do they publish on average per year? Rather than asking, have they accumulated a record of accomplishment that is consistent with the decision that this person deserves tenure? I believe we should institutionally, regardless of COVID, be thinking about tenure that way and all of our accomplishments that way. The issue isn't, did you do it this year? The issue is, have you done it? And I believe that we should be much less focused on time-based indicators, and we need to signal that to external evaluators as well as to internal committee members.
I think that's an important and an interesting point. In a recent economics journal, there are a couple of articles about reliance on things like impact factor of the journal in which people have published, H-index, number of citations, and that there are known ways to increase all of those that do not have anything to do with quality or creativity. And a suggestion that those be abandoned in favor of looking at the work. And it's, Abby and I think it's so strange. People don't want to read what people have written, but that is what's going to tell you what is the significance of this work, what's its value, what's its originality, what kind of contribution is it making? So that focus on what is happening there is something that we really need in all times to be thinking about how to change.
So we have, there's an echo on my end, apologies. We have one last question, and this will be the last question, but lots of comments in the chat. This is by Marielle. What is your opinion on the use of diversity statements for hiring and merit promotion, and on the controversies surrounding this topic?
Could you say more first about what the controversy is?
Marielle, are you here still?
Yeah, I'm right here. Thank you so much for a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm a professor in mathematics at UC Davis, and at least in mathematics, there's been a big controversy that has spread around to the rest of the, I even venture to say, University of California community, not only focused on Davis. And people who advocate for academic freedom are against diversity statements because they believe they are a way of making a political statement. And if the university requires them, then the university is imposing something similar to McCarthyism on us.
Gee, I'm happy I didn't know about this before. Okay, so I think that that's really twisting what diversity statements are supposed to be doing. And I think that, again, by concentrating on universal design and emphasizing that the goal is to come up with a climate, policies, and procedures that will help everyone do their best work, that might be something that can mitigate that. And I also think we need to be somewhat flexible about the various ways that people can contribute to diversity. So some people will contribute by writing. Some people will contribute by more actively engaging with students and faculty. Some people will contribute by working in their community. There are a lot of different ways that people can contribute. So I think emphasizing that you're supposed to do something, not just say something, and that whatever you do should be part of an effort in which everyone is going to benefit. That might help to make people feel more comfortable about using those criteria. I'll let Abby.
Well, I think you've said a lot of really helpful things. You know, I personally worry about the reliance on these statements per se, because there's also a lot of activity going on in teaching people how to write good statements. So, you know, we can teach people to write to the test and they will learn how to do that because they're bright. So they will say stuff that they don't necessarily actually mean to do. And I'm in complete agreement with Virginia that what we care about is the creation of a diverse, equitable, and inclusive university. That's the goal. And we don't need people who can talk about it. We need people who can actually do it. That said, at the moment, I do think those statements are evidence that if we articulate pretty clearly the kind of information we want, I think that helps. If the information is behavioral and it's, as Virginia said, flexible, you can express it in a lot of different ways. It doesn't all have to look one way. I think it's difficult to argue when cardinal values of academics are open access or equal access to the institution by all groups and reliance on merit rather than on birth or other features of a person's social identity. These are very strongly held values about inclusion that left, right, and middle agree on. And so I think the key is to kind of emphasize, as Virginia said, the universal design features about the actual statements, and the process of how we use the statements.
Thank you very much.
I think we are almost, actually we are out of time. So I want to thank Dr. Valian and Dr. Stewart for the excellent presentations and for also the excellent questions and the very, very good discussions. So hopefully we can continue these discussions. And I think, you know, and Marcy could add if she wants, I think it's time for the 15 minutes break, and make sure to come for the next very important session on organizations in advancing STEM. So that will be 3:15, right, Marcy?
Yes, it will be. Yeah, at 3:15.
I'm sorry, 2:15, not
2:15 Central Daylight Time.
Yes.
Yes, because we're all in different time zones. Yeah. So we'll see you in about 13 minutes. This is a break. The last panel of the day is on organizations supporting Latinas in STEM or leveraging their organizations to support Latinas in STEM. So we're very excited to close the symposium out with that conversation. So we'll see you in a bit. Thanks everyone for being here.